Cold was the first thing to register, a deep and penetrating chill that seeped through the thin fabric of his robe and into his bones. Then came the darkness, not the gentle dark of a moonless night, but an absolute oppressive blackness that felt heavy and thick, like a physical shroud. Arian stirred on the hard metal slab that served as his bed, his limbs stiff and aching. The air was stale, tasting of rust, recycled oxygen, and the faint, coppery tang of fear. This was the belly of a black ship, a vessel of the Imperium designed for one grim purpose, to hunt and collect those touched by the warp. Memory returned in a painful, unwelcome rush. The knock on his door in the dead of night, the grim-faced men in the sigil-marked carapace of the Inquisition. They had not asked questions. They had not needed to. Their blank-eyed helms had seen the truth of him, the flicker of the other that lived behind his eyes. He had tried to hide it, to bury the strange whispers and the subtle shifts. In reality that only he could perceive, all for the sake of a quiet life on a dusty frontier world. It had not been enough. They had taken him from his home, from his wife's terrified scream and his daughter's confused tears, as easily as plucking a weed. His hand, trembling slightly, crept to his chest. Beneath the rough-spun robe, his fingers found the edges of the small, faded pick. He didn't need light to see it. The image was burned into his mind. His family smiling in the sun-drenched fields behind their hab unit, a moment of perfect, simple happiness frozen in time. He clutched the flimsy piece of plastic as if it were a holy relic, the only tether he had to the life that was stolen from him. Fear coiled in his gut, a cold serpent of dread for the unknown fate that awaited him. Yet, intertwined with that fear was a fragile, desperate hope. The Imperium spoke of service, of a great and holy duty. Perhaps his sacrifice, the surrender of his cursed power, would be enough to keep them safe. Perhaps his name would be recorded in some ledger, a footnote in the great saga of humanity's survival, and that would be his legacy. The sharp, metallic clang of a bolt being thrown echoed through the cell, impossibly loud in the silence. A sliver of harsh, artificial light stabbed into the darkness, making him flinch. Two figures filled the doorway, massive and intimidating in their full black carapace armor. Their featureless helms betrayed no emotion, no hint of the men beneath. They were simply instruments of a will greater than their own. Without a word, rough hands seized him, hauling him to his feet. His legs, weak from disuse, nearly buckled. As they dragged him from the cell into the dimly lit corridor, his senses, always more acute than those of other men, reached out instinctively. The ship was a tomb. To his left and right stretched an endless line of identical metal doors, each one sealed. But it was the silence that was most unnerving. Not a true silence, for he could hear the distant hum of the ship's engines and the heavy tread of his guards, but a psychic one. Behind those doors were others like him, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them. Yet he felt no flicker of their consciousness, no shared terror or whispered thought. It was as if they were already ghosts, their souls muffled and suppressed, each one a doomed spark waiting to be extinguished. The hope he had clung to felt suddenly very small and very, very foolish. The transition from the silent, individual tombs of the cells to the collective misery of the transport hold was a descent into a new kind of hell. Arian was propelled forward by a shove between his shoulder blades, stumbling into a cavernous space that reeked of 1,000 unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic scent of pure, undiluted fear. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the exhalations of the damned. Low, grox-hide lumiglobes cast a sickly yellow glow over a scene of profound wretchedness. Hundreds of souls, all clad in the same drab, gray robes as his own, were packed into the hold like cargo, pressed shoulder to shoulder on hard metal benches that ran the length of the shuddering vessel. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the deck plates, the sound of powerful engines awakening. It was a sound that promised a journey with no return. All around him, whispers slithered through the gloom, a susurrus of terrified speculation. He caught fragments of sentences, words laden with both dread and a desperate, blasphemous hope. Terra, the throne world, the God Emperor's service. The names were mythical, pillars of the imperial faith he had been raised on, but here in this stinking pen they sounded like sentences. He tried to find a patch of deck to call his own, a small space to retreat into himself, but there was nowhere. The press of humanity was absolute, a tide of shared despair. Seeking an anchor, Arian closed his eyes and attempted to meditate, to find the quiet center of his mind where the whispers of the warp could be silenced. It was a practice born of a lifetime of hiding, of forcing the strange and wonderful chaos within him into a small, manageable box. But here, there was no quiet to be found. The fear of those around him was a psychic miasma, a fog of anguish that clung to his consciousness. And then it happened. A violent lurch that was felt not in the body, but in the soul. The world outside the ship's armored hull tore open, and reality screamed. The warp jump was not a smooth transition, but a brutal, wrenching dislocation. The air crackled with unseen energy, and the whispers in the hold were drowned out by a psychic echo, a chorus of 1,000,000 silent screams from the Imperium, all crashing against the ship's gellar field at once. Arian gasped, his hands flying to his temples as visions of impossible colors and non-Euclidean geometries flickered behind his eyelids. He felt the minds around him recoil in unison, a collective flinch from the abyss they were now traversing. His meditation shattered, leaving him raw and exposed to the emotional torrent of the hold. When the initial shock subsided, he became aware of a presence beside him. A young woman, her face pale and drawn but her dark eyes holding a startling clarity amidst the surrounding terror. She had watched his struggle without judgment. Her name was Ilara, offered in a soft, steady voice that seemed to carve a small pocket of calm in the chaos. They did not speak of their pasts. Such things were meaningless here. Instead, they spoke of their future or the lack of one. It was Ilara who gave voice to the rumor that haunted the hold. She spoke not with fear, but with a quiet, fervent conviction. She believed they were destined for the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that guided imperial ships through the nightmare of the warp. Their lives, their very souls, were to be the fuel. It was not a death to be feared, she whispered, but a final, glorious service. To become part of the light that held back the darkness for all of humanity. Her faith was a shield, polished and bright, and for a fleeting moment, Arian felt its warmth. In her belief, he found a fragile counterpoint to his own gnawing dread, a single, steady star in the overwhelming blackness of their journey. The fragile calm Arian had found in Ilara's conviction shattered as the warp's grip on the ship tightened. The initial, violent lurch into the immaterium had been a prelude. Now the true journey began, a voyage through a realm where the laws of physics were mere suggestions and sanity was a perishable commodity. The constant, low thrum of the gellar field became the only anchor to reality, a fragile bubble of reason in an ocean of screaming madness. Inside that bubble, the psykers were not safe, only insulated. The horrors outside pressed in, seeping through the cracks in their minds. For Arian, the journey became a waking nightmare. With his eyes closed, he did not see the dark, cramped hold, but vistas of impossible, shifting geometry. Mountains of weeping flesh pulsed with a sickening rhythm under a sky of boiling, sentient color. He heard things, not with his ears, but in the core of his soul. It was a chorus of psychic screams, the agonized echoes of those lost to the warp, their torment eternal and amplified. Worse were the whispers, silken and insidious, promising power, freedom, and secrets that would unravel the universe itself. They spoke in voices he recognized, his wife's gentle tone, his daughter's playful giggle twisted into something predatory and vile. Demonic shapes coalesced in the periphery of his vision, things with too many eyes and limbs that bent in wrong directions, their attention fixed hungrily upon the ship and the bright, vulnerable souls within. His faith, once a sturdy pillar, began to crumble. What kind of universe permitted such abominations to exist? What god would allow his servants to traverse this hell? The Imperial Creed spoke of the Emperor's divine protection, but here, in the gut of the warp, that protection felt thin and theoretical. The hope that his sacrifice was for a noble cause felt like a child's fantasy, a story told to make the cattle walk willingly to the slaughter. He trembled, cold sweat beading on his skin, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the bench. He was not a willing servant on a holy pilgrimage. He was prey, being delivered. A warm pressure on his arm pulled him back. Alara's hand was there, her grip firm and grounding. She had seen the terror in his eyes, felt the tremors that racked his body. She did not flinch from the demonic echoes he knew were dancing at the edges of his perception. Instead, she began to speak, her voice a low, steady cadence against the psychic cacophony. She recounted the oldest legends, the tales every imperial child learned but few truly believed. She spoke of the emperor not as a distant, silent god, but as a man, a savior who had risen in humanity's darkest age, who had fought back the monsters of old night and united the stars under one banner. She described his eternal vigil upon the golden throne, a sacrifice so vast it dwarfed their own, a conscious choice to endure unimaginable agony for the sake of every human soul. Her words were not a denial of the horrors around them, but a reinterpretation. The warp was the reason the Emperor's light was necessary. The demons were the very darkness his astronomican pushed back. Just as her words began to weave a new, fragile shield around his crumbling resolve, the universe shifted again. The oppressive psychic weight lifted in an instant. The screaming colors and whispering demons vanished, replaced by the stark, mundane reality of the ship's hold. The transition from warp to real space was a release of pressure so sudden it left him gasping. A collective, shuddering sigh went through the assembled psykers. Through a nearby viewport, shielded by thick plasteel, world swam into view, Terra. It was not the green and blue orb of myth, but a monument to imperial might. A fortress world, its entire surface encased in a sprawling, mountainous hive of impossible scale. Towers of adamantine and rockreet clawed at the void, their peaks lost in smog and artificial weather systems. The light of the sun glinted off countless orbital docks and defense platforms, a glittering necklace of death around the throne world's throat. It was a sight that should have inspired awe, a testament to human achievement. For Arian, it inspired a profound and chilling dread. This was not a place of mercy or grace. It was a machine, vast and uncaring. He stared at the colossal, armored sphere, wondering if he would ever feel its soil beneath his feet, or if its surface was a privilege reserved for those not marked for the inner sanctums, for the silent, hungry dark at the heart of all this glorious, terrifying power. The final approach was a symphony of shuddering metal and groaning infrastructure, the transport ship a weary beast returning to its cage. Through the grime-caked viewport, Arian watched the landscape of holy Terra resolve from a distant, armored sphere into an overwhelming vertical reality. The landing pad was a vast expanse of worn ceramite, surrounded by towering spires that pierced a sky the color of burnt brass, their peaks lost in the perpetual industrial haze. This was not a world of soil and stone, but a single, planet-wide machine, and they were being slotted into its grim mechanism. As the ship settled onto its berth with a final, hydraulic sigh, the hold's atmosphere shifted from weary dread to sharp, immediate terror. The massive rear ramp descended with a deafening whine, and the stale, recycled air of the hold was swept away by a torrent of Terra's own breath, a choking cocktail of ozone, promethium fumes, and the cloying scent of sacred incense burned in industrial quantities. The light that flooded in was not the gentle glow of a star, but the harsh, white glare of countless lumen banks, illuminating a scene of terrifying order. A cordon of Adeptus Arbites formed a grim, black and blue wall, their shock mauls held ready, their faceless helms scanning the emerging psykers with mechanical dispassion. They were the fist of imperial law, impersonal and absolute. Moving among them were robed priests of the Adeptus Ministorum, their faces hidden deep within heavy hoods, their voices raised in a monotonous, droning chant of high Gothic litanies. The words were meant to soothe and sanctify, but to Arian's ears, They sounded like a funeral dirge. The sacred and the martial had merged here, creating a ritual of processing that was as efficient as it was soulless. He was swept forward in the tide of bodies, pushed toward a series of metal tables manned by scribes and menials. When his turn came, rough hands patted him down with practiced indifference. The procedure was swift, brutal, and devoid of any recognition of his humanity. A scribe, his face a pale mask of boredom, grunted as he recorded Arian's assigned numeric designation on a data slate. Then came the moment he had dreaded. Another set of hands, these clad in thick work gloves, rifled through the meager possessions he had retained. His robe was searched, and with a final, dismissive tug, the faded pict of his family was plucked from its hidden fold. The gloved hand did not pause, did not regard the image of a smiling woman and child. It was simply tossed into a nearby bin filled with 1,000 other tiny, forgotten treasures, lockets, carved stones, scraps of parchment, all the shattered remnants of lives left behind. The loss was a physical blow, a final severance from the man he had been. Propelled forward once more, he was merged into an endless, shuffling line of gray-robed figures. The line snaked away from the landing pad, a river of human sorrow flowing into the bowels of the Imperial Palace itself. He chanced to look upward, his gaze climbing the impossible architecture. There, piercing the smog, were the spires of the palace, so high they seemed to hold up the very sky. They were adorned with colossal statues of saints and heroes, their stone eyes looking out over an empire they would never recognize. In their shadow, Arian felt a crushing insignificance. He was less than a speck, a single momentary flicker in a billion-year saga. He was a resource being logged, processed, and moved along a preordained path. The chanting of the priests grew louder, blending with the barked orders of the guards. The line began to move, not onto the surface of the throne world, but downward into a wide, ramp-like entrance that gaped like a stone mouth in the side of a colossal bastion. The grim-faced Arbites herded them forward, their presence a constant, unyielding pressure. As he crossed the threshold, leaving the open, if polluted, air of the landing pad behind, the temperature dropped. The light from the lumen banks faded, replaced by the grim, red glow of emergency lumiglobes. He was now inside the machine, and the great, grinding gears of the Imperium were pulling him inexorably toward its fiery, hungry heart. The transition from the cavernous landing bay into the interior of the Imperial Palace was like being swallowed by a living monument. The sheer scale was the first assault on Arian's senses, a crushing weight of history and power that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. They were marched through grand, echoing halls so vast that their footsteps, a 1,000-strong shuffle of hopelessness, were lost in the immensity. The vaulted ceilings soared into shadows high above, lost to sight, while underfoot mosaics of incredible complexity depicted the Emperor's great crusade in chips of colored stone and polished bone. The walls were lined with statues, not of simple men, but of saints and heroes rendered in marble, adamantine, and gold. Their faces were masks of stern resolve, or beatific grace, their stone eyes seeming to follow the ragged procession of psykers with a judgment that was millennia old. The air here was different, too, cleansed of the industrial stench of the landing pad, and heavy instead with the cloying perfume of sanctified incense, burned in vast, golden censers that swung from chains as thick as a man's torso, tended by silent, hooded servitors. Yet, even this grandeur was a prelude to the descent. The wide, glorious avenues began to narrow. The golden light from ornate luminescent panels set into the ceilings dimmed, replaced by the colder, blue-tinged glow of lumen strips. The intricate mosaics gave way to plain, polished rockery, and the heroic statues were replaced by stark bas-relief aquilas, their twin heads staring blankly from the walls. The air grew colder, the sanctified incense now mingling with the older, more fundamental smells of damp stone, ozone from hidden machinery, and the faint, metallic scent of recirculated air that had passed through too many lungs. The despair, which had been a shared, nebulous cloud in the transport hold, now began to crystallize around each individual, a private shroud as the magnificent facade of the Imperium peeled away to reveal the grim machinery beneath. As the corridors grew darker and the air colder, Arian's mind retreated inward, seeking refuge in a past that felt as distant as the stars. He remembered the dust, the red, iron-rich dust of his frontier world, Lycus, that settled on everything and turned the twin suns into bloody orbs at dawn and dusk. He remembered the sprawling, low-slung agrihabs, the scent of hardy, genetically engineered crops on the wind, and the simple, back-breaking work of a life lived under an open sky. Most of all, he remembered the fear, a constant, low-grade hum that had been the background noise of his existence, the flicker of a thought that could snuff a candle flame across the room, the whisper that could quiet a barking grox in a distant pen. He had hidden it, burying the wonderful, terrifying power deep within, constructing a persona of a simple, unremarkable farmer. He had built a life, a family, on a foundation of a lie, all for the chance at normalcy. Now that carefully constructed life was gone, and the very thing he had hidden was the reason he was here, marching to his end in the heart of the Imperium. His hand, out of instinct, twitched toward his chest, seeking the comfort of the faded pict, finding only the rough texture of his robe. The loss was a fresh, cold void inside him. He clutched instead at the memory of the image, of his wife's smile and his daughter's bright eyes. He clung to the hope, now grown thin and brittle as ancient parchment, that his sacrifice would mean something. That somewhere, in some forgotten administratum ledger, his designation would be noted not just as a unit of psychic fuel, but as Arian of Lycus, who gave his life so that the light of the astronomican might continue to burn. He wanted to believe that this light would, in some small way, reach back across the void and keep his family safe, that his name would be remembered, even if only as a whisper in the dark. But the hope was a feeble flame in a growing gale. The air grew heavier with every step, the incense now so thick it was a physical presence, coating the back of his throat. It no longer smelled holy but funereal. It was the scent of sanctified oblivion, masking a deeper, more profound odor that his psychic senses could now detect beneath the perfume. The cold, dry scent of ancient stone, of industrial solvents, and the profound, soul-deep despair of the billions who had walked this exact path before him. The procession was no longer a march through a palace, but a descent into a gullet, and the air itself was the breath of the beast, heavy with the promise of consumption. The grand, echoing halls of the procession were a fading memory, a beautiful lie that had been peeled back to reveal the raw, ugly truth beneath. The wide corridors constricted, funneling the endless river of gray robes into a narrow, rock-hewn tunnel that felt more like a vein within a living mountain than a constructed passage. The air changed instantly, losing the last vestiges of incense and taking on the cold, dry breath of deep earth and ancient, worked stone. The most profound change, however, was the pressure. It was a physical weight, a colossal burden of faith, history, and rock that pressed down on Arian's shoulders, making each breath a conscious effort. He was no longer walking through the Imperial Palace. He was being buried within the fundament of Terra itself, the unimaginable mass of the throne world's architecture and dogma entombing him alive. The light, too, had transformed. Gone were the golden panels and bright lumen strips. Here, flickering lumiglobes, encased in rusted iron cages, were bolted to the rough-hewn walls at irregular intervals. They cast a sickly, jaundiced glow that did little to push back the darkness, instead creating a chaotic dance of shadows that writhed and twisted with every step the procession took. The shadows pooled in the deep gouges left by ancient mining tools, making the walls themselves seem to shift and breathe. Carved into the stone at regular points was the Imperial Aquila, the two-headed eagle of the Imperium. But here, deep in the dark, the symbol seemed less a mark of glory and more a brand of ownership, its stern lines rendered sinister by the flickering, unreliable light. It was a reminder that even here in this suffocating dark, the Emperor's gaze, or perhaps just his machine's attention, was upon them. The tunnel began to pass recessed archways, each one sealed with a heavy, barred gate of black iron. Behind these gates were cells, and within the cells were the remnants of those who had come before. Arian's senses, raw and hypersensitive, recoiled from the psychic void within. These were not psykers crackling with untamed power or whispering in fear. These were hollowed-out shells, their minds already broken by the oppressive weight of this place or drained by some unseen mechanism. Most were catatonic, sitting or lying in perfect stillness, their eyes wide and unseeing, staring at nothing. A few, however, moved. They were the most unsettling. They rocked back and forth with a slow, metronomic rhythm, or their lips moved in silent, ceaseless prayers. He caught fragments of high Gothic litanies, the words slurred and mangled, spoken with the desperate, repetitive fervor of minds clinging to the last shred of a familiar ritual as their sanity dissolved around them. The sound was not one of faith, but of mental ruin. A cold spike of pure terror lanced through Arian's heart. This was not a journey to a noble sacrifice. This was a descent into a psychic abattoir where souls were left to spoil before being consumed. The pressure of the mountain above him, the sight of the broken wretches in their cells, the oppressive, hungry silence, it all conspired to crush his resolve. The hope that had been his companion, however fragile, threatened to shatter into a million pieces. The whispers of despair, both from the cells and from the dark corners of his own mind, began to sound like the only truth. Then, cutting through the psychic static of dread, he remembered Alara. Her face, pale but resolute in the gloom of the transport hold, surfaced in his mind's eye. He recalled the steady cadence of her voice as she spoke of the Astronomicon, not as a pyre, but as a lighthouse. Our deaths will guide lost ships home, she had said, her faith a solid, unshakable thing. In this place of crushing nihilism, her words became his anchor. He focused on them, repeating them like a mantra in his mind, using them to build a small, mental barricade against the encroaching madness. He would not end up like the whispering, broken things in the cells. He would hold onto the meaning she had given him. He would believe until the very last moment that his life was not being wasted but spent. Clutching this single, shining thought, Arian fixed his eyes on the back of the person in front of him and continued his march, step by agonizing step, deeper into the swallowing dark. The deeper they went, the more the line of psykers began to falter, the steady, shuffling rhythm of their march breaking into a hesitant, stop-start crawl. The air grew denser, humming with a low, subaudible thrum that vibrated in the fillings of Arian's teeth and set his bones to aching. It was a psychic resonance, a pressure that built with every yard they descended, a palpable sign that they were approaching the epicenter of some unimaginable power. The rough-hewn tunnel walls seemed to absorb the sound of their passage, creating an eerie, muffled silence that was broken only by the occasional clank of a guard's armored boot or a stifled sob from further up the line. This close to their final destination, the guards' vigilance seemed to slacken, their conversations no longer hushed commands but casual, weary exchanges. Arian, his senses stretched thin by fear and the oppressive atmosphere, caught fragments of their talk. They spoke not of psykers or sacrifices, but of duty rotations and the quality of their recaf, their words mundane and chillingly disconnected from the horror of their task. Then one of them, a sergeant with a scarred cheek, gestured with a thumb toward the pulsating energy that seemed to emanate from the rock itself. "Almost there," he grunted to his companion. "Can feel the thrones pull in my teeth. The golden bastard must be hungry today." The casual blasphemy, the reduction of the god emperor to a hungry entity, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through Arian. This was not a holy pilgrimage. It was a feeding time, and the guards were the herders. The line halted completely before a side alcove where a priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus stood, his face a pale, emotionless mask. Beneath a crimson hood, his movements were precise, mechanical, as he anointed the forehead of each passing psyker with a thick, pungent oil from a silver vial. The substance was cold and left a greasy smear that smelled of ozone and sanctified chemicals. As he worked, his metallic voice chanted a low litany in binary and high Gothic, a stream of code and prayer that buzzed in the air. Arian could pick out words like conduit, ignition, and holy combustion, but their theological and mechanical context was a mystery to him. The ritual felt less like a blessing and more like the priming of a weapon, the final calibration of a component before it was slotted into a vast and terrible machine. Then, as the line lurched forward again, he saw her. Ilara was a dozen bodies ahead, her slender form unmistakable even in the grim procession. She turned her head slightly, her profile caught in the sickly glow of a flickering lumiglobe. Her face was pale, etched with the same fear that gripped them all, but her eyes found his across the short, impossible distance, and she smiled. It was a faint, tremulous thing, a mere ghost of an expression, but it held no surrender. It was a look of profound understanding, a final, silent affirmation of the faith they had shared in the darkness of the transport hold. It was a spark of shared humanity in the dehumanizing gloom. In that fleeting moment, as her gaze met his, the cold dread that had been coiling in his gut was burned away by a surge of fierce, desperate resolve. Her smile was a shield and a promise. He would not let her down. He would not let the terror of this place, or the casual cruelty of the guards, or the cold ritual of the priest, strip the meaning from his end. He would walk into the light holding onto that smile, believing, as she did, that their souls would become part of the beacon that held the night at bay. Strengthened, he straightened his shoulders and took the next step forward, his heart a drumbeat of grim purpose in the crushing, resonant dark. The low, monastic chanting that had been a distant accompaniment to their descent swelled suddenly, transforming from a background murmur into a physical force. It was a chorus, a deafening wave of sound that crashed against the rough-hewn walls of the tunnel and reverberated deep within Arian's chest. The sound was no longer that of a single priest, but of dozens, perhaps hundreds. Their voices merged into a single, overwhelming torrent of high Gothic prayer. The language was ancient, sanctified, and utterly alien, its guttural syllables and rolling cadences meant to invoke powers beyond mortal comprehension. The air itself seemed to thicken with the sound, becoming a syrup of devotion and dread that was difficult to breathe. They emerged from the constricted tunnel into a vast, circular antechamber. The ceiling was lost in shadow, but the walls were lined with tiered stone galleries, each one filled with rows of figures clad in heavy robes of arterial crimson. Their faces were hidden deep within their hoods, their hands clasped before them or holding flickering data tapers. They stood perfectly still, their bodies rigid, but their mouths moved in perfect mechanical unison, producing the soul-shaking chorus that filled the hall. They were human, yet they moved with the soulless precision of automata, their individuality consumed by the ritual. They paced in slow, measured steps along the galleries, their crimson forms like drops of blood against the dark stone, their chant a ceaseless, grinding engine of faith. Arian, his mind reeling, tried to grasp onto fragments of the prayer, to find some meaning in the sonic deluge. His limited understanding of High Gothic, gleaned from frontier world sermons, allowed him to pick out words that repeated like hammer blows against an anvil. Sacrifice. The word echoed not as a noble offering but as a transaction, a necessary expenditure. Eternal light. It was always paired with sacrifice, a promise of an undying flame bought with endless pain, oblation, fuel, ignition. The liturgical language of the Ministorum was laid bare, stripped of its poetry to reveal a brutal mechanical truth. As these meanings slotted into place in his mind, a strange and treacherous sensation began to wash over him. It was a false peace, a psychic balm woven into the very fabric of the chanting. It whispered to his fears, soothing them, promising transcendence and unity with the divine. For a terrifying moment, his terror subsided, replaced by a warm, accepting lassitude. The urge to simply let go, to become one with the glorious, thunderous sound, was almost overpowering. The spell was shattered by a sudden commotion ahead. A psyker, a man with a gaunt, skeletal frame, stumbled out of the shuffling line. His body convulsed once, a violent, uncoordinated spasm, and then he simply collapsed. He did not cry out. He folded silently onto the cold stone floor like a marionette with its strings cut. There was no pause in the chanting. The crimson-robed priests did not miss a syllable. Their devotion was absolute, their focus unbreakable. Only the black-armored guards reacted. Two of them moved forward with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and devoid of emotion. They did not check for a pulse, did not offer aid. One took the man's shoulders, the other his feet, and they dragged the limp body away from the line, through a small, arched doorway that led into a deeper darkness. The man's robe scraped against the stone, a soft, rasping counterpoint to the soaring prayers. The false peace that had gripped Arian evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. The warmth was a lie. The chanting was not a comfort. It was an anesthetic, a psychic numbing agent applied to the herd before the slaughter. The collapse was not a failure of faith, but a failure of the material, a component breaking under strain before it could be used. The dragging away of the body was not a moment of mercy, but the removal of spoiled goods. The fear that returned was different now. It was no longer a nebulous dread of the unknown, but a specific, chilling terror of the known. He understood the function of this place. He was on a conveyor belt, and the thunderous, beautiful, horrifying chorus of the doomed was the sound of the machine operating at peak efficiency. It began as a faint, sickly stain upon the oppressive darkness ahead, a pulsating glow that seemed to breathe in time with the thunderous chanting. With every step forward, the stain grew, resolving into a shimmering, golden haze that clung to the end of the vast antechamber like a false dawn. This was no pure, divine radiance. It was a feverish, unnatural light, throbbing with a rhythm that felt both alien and intimately familiar. It pulsed like a diseased heart, each beat sending a wave of psychic pressure through the air that made Arian's teeth ache and his skin prickle. It was a siren's call woven from pure energy, and he felt its pull deep within his soul, an irresistible gravitational tug that drew him forward as surely as a moth is drawn to a consuming flame. The psychic pull was a physical sensation, a hook set deep in the core of his being, reeling him in. It was a complex, horrifying mixture of reverence and terror. One moment, it felt like the warm, welcoming embrace of a divine parent, promising an end to fear and a unity with something vast and eternal. The next, it was the gnawing hunger of a starved leviathan, a predatory awareness that saw him not as a man but as sustenance. This duality tore at his mind, each pulse of light rewriting his emotions. He wanted to fall to his knees in worship and simultaneously turn and flee screaming back into the dark. His body, however, had no choice. The line pressed forward, and his feet moved of their own accord, carrying him toward the shimmering, golden maw. As the light washed over him, warm and heavy like liquid honey, memory surfaced from the depths of his childhood, a fragment from a time before fear and hiding. He saw the simple, whitewashed walls of the Scola on Lycus and heard the gentle, firm voice of the lay preceptor. The man had spoken of the Emperor's grace, a golden light that watched over all of humanity, a beacon of hope and protection. In those tales, the Emperor was a kind, if distant, father, his power a gentle warmth that nurtured his people. That childhood faith, long since buried under years of persecution and dread, now surged forward, offering a final, desperate interpretation of the terrifying radiance before him. This had to be it. This was the God Emperor's grace, the source of the Astronomicon. It was fierce and overwhelming because the darkness it held back was infinitely worse. Clutching this thought like a lifeline, Arian focused on Alara's final, steadfast belief. He hoped with every fiber of his being that his death would not be meaningless. He envisioned his soul, his cursed power being unwound and woven into the great guiding song of the Astronomicon. He saw a lone Imperial vessel, lost in the howling madness of the warp, its crew praying for deliverance. And he saw a single, new note of light, born from his agony, cutting through the Imperial storm to guide them home. That would be his legacy. That would be the purpose that justified this terrifying journey. It would be a death that mattered. He took another step, and then another, the golden light now bathing him fully. The warmth he had felt from a distance was indeed there, a comforting heat on his skin that stood in stark contrast to the tunnel's chill. But it was wrong. It was not the warmth of a sun or a hearth. It was the feverish, dry heat of a body burning up from within, the unnatural warmth of a powerful engine bleeding excess energy. It felt ancient, mechanical, and utterly devoid of the benevolent, living presence he had been taught to expect. It was the heat of a forge, not a sanctuary. Yet holding fast to his hope, to the memory of the Scola and the conviction in Alara's smile, Arian did not resist. He stepped closer, allowing the sickly, pulsating golden glow to envelop him, a willing sacrifice marching into the heart of what he prayed was a divine fire, and not the gullet of a machine. The final steps were the longest of his life, a slow, dreamlike progression toward the source of the pulsating, golden glare. The thunderous chanting of the crimson-robed priests faded into a dull, background roar, muffled by the sheer intensity of the light that now dominated all his senses. He stood at the precipice, a stone archway so vast its apex was lost in the shimmering haze, marking the entrance to the chamber. Through that arch, he witnessed the final, silent moments of those who had marched ahead of him. One by one, the gray-robed figures reached the blinding core of the radiance, their silhouettes stark for a single, heart-stopping instant before they simply vanished. There was no sound, no flash, no cry. They were there and then they were not, absorbed into the light as if they had never been. It was a dissolution, a perfect and terrifying erasure that stole the breath from his lungs. A figure moved beside him, resolving from the glare, a priest in robes of stark, unadorned black, his face a roadmap of severe piety and deep-set wrinkles. The priest's eyes, pale and piercing, held no comfort, only a cold, analytical focus. He raised a hand, the fingers long and bony, and before Arian could flinch, pressed his thumb firmly into the center of Arian's forehead. The touch was not gentle. A jolt of energy, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, lanced through Arian's skull. It was not a blessing but a final calibration, a psychic trigger that resonated with the chamber's hungry light, priming him for consumption. The world swam for a moment, the golden glare flickering with afterimages of stark geometric patterns. In that suspended moment, with the cold energy still crackling behind his eyes, Arian's mind turned inward one last time. He did not see the grand mosaics of the palace or hear the droning litanies. He saw the red dust of Lycus, the simple lines of his hab unit, and the two faces that made his life worth living. His wife's laugh, a sound he had not heard in an eternity. His daughter's small hand in his. He clutched at these memories, building a final, silent fortress around them. His lips moved, forming words with no breath behind them, a final, desperate prayer sent not to the distant emperor on his throne, but to the family he would never see again. Keep them safe. Let my death mean something. Remember me. The prayer was a tiny, fragile thing, a single, unvoiced whisper in the face of the all-consuming glare. It changed nothing. The line pressed forward. There was no more time for thought, for fear, for hope. He was at the threshold. The golden light filled his vision, his hearing, his very soul, a physical pressure demanding his surrender. He drew a final, shuddering breath of the antechamber's incense-heavy air, a breath that tasted of dust and endings. Then, with a resolve that was less courage and more the final exhaustion of all other options, Arian stepped across the stone sill and into the chamber. His senses, psychic and mundane, were immediately and utterly overwhelmed by the blinding, deafening, soul-searing intensity of the golden throne. The transition was absolute. One moment there was the world, the stone archway, the muffled chanting, the press of bodies. The next there was only the light. It was not an illumination but a substance, a thick golden syrup that poured into his eyes, his ears, his mouth, drowning all sense of self in a sea of incandescent force. The pressure was immense, a psychic gravity that pinned him in place, and rough, impersonal hands seized his arms and legs. He was half carried, half dragged across a floor of seamless, polished black stone that reflected the blinding glare from above, his feet scraping uselessly. Through the overwhelming sensory assault, he registered the cold, a deep and sudden chill that seeped into his back as he was forced down onto a hard, unyielding surface. It was a slab, wide and metallic, its surface so cold it felt like a brand against his skin. Thick adamantine bands, humming with a low energy of their own, clamped over his wrists, ankles, and forehead with a series of final hydraulic hisses. The contact was intimate and absolute, locking him into a spread-eagle position, a specimen pinned for examination. The golden light swirled above him, and within its heart he could now make out shapes, tall, robed figures moving with a slow, ceremonial grace. Priests. Their faces were hidden in the glare, but their voices rose in a new chant, a sharper, more focused litany that cut through the general roar like scalpels. The words were ancient, technical, and dripped with a terrifying purpose. Each syllable seemed to tighten the bands around his limbs, binding him not just physically but psychically to the slab. As the chanting built, so did the energy in the chamber. It was a palpable force, a gathering storm that made the air crackle with ozone and raw power. Arian's body began to tremble, not from fear alone, but from a resonance that vibrated in his very bones. His psychic senses, so long suppressed and feared, were not just awakening. They were being violently ripped open, flayed wide by the ritual's intent. The golden light ceased to be just light. It became a lens, and through it, visions erupted behind his eyes, not as memories, but as lived experiences flooding into his soul. He saw legions of warriors in power armor of pure white and gold, their banners flying high as they marched across worlds of fire and ash. He felt the thunder of 1,000,000 boots, the righteous fury of a crusade to reclaim the stars for humanity. He witnessed the construction of great wonders, the signing of treaties with forgotten empires, the lighting of beacons on 1,000 worlds, pushing back the darkness of old night. It was the Emperor's great crusade, the foundational myth of the Imperium, and he was not an observer but a participant, feeling the collective hope, the determination, the sheer glorious scale of it all. A surge of pride, vast and intoxicating, washed over him. This was what he was a part of. This was the legacy his death would sustain. He was contributing to the survival of all this glory, his soul a brick in the unassailable wall protecting humanity from the dark. The fear and the cold were a small price to pay, but as the vision of conquering heroes faded, his gaze, sharpened by both the light and his unraveling psyche, focused on the priests surrounding his slab. He saw past the ritualistic movements and the sanctified robes. He looked into their eyes, and he saw nothing. No fervor, no piety, not even the cold focus of the Mechanicus priest. Their eyes were empty, glassy orbs reflecting the golden light but holding no inner spark of their own. They were hollow men, their movements too precise, too repetitive, as if they had performed this exact ritual 10,000 times before and would perform it 10,000 times again. They were not conduits of divine will. They were parts of the machine, their humanity long since scoured away by the endless, grinding repetition of sacrifice. The glorious vision of the crusade flickered, and for a terrifying instant, the pride he felt curdled in his veins, the first, faint crack appearing in the edifice of his hope. The chanting did not merely intensify, it mutated. The precise, technical litanies of the priests twisted, their rhythm breaking into a frantic, jagged staccato that clawed at the air. The sound was no longer a prayer but a command, a series of psychic hooks being driven into the fabric of reality, and Arian's soul was the bait on the line. He felt it happen, a sickening, internal lurch as if some essential part of him had been snagged and was now being drawn out. It was pulled toward the source of the golden light, not into a divine embrace, but into the presence of something vast, ancient, and ravenously, mechanically hungry. The warmth that had once felt like a promise now burned with the dry, desperate heat of a starved furnace. Agony followed, swift and absolute. It was not the simple pain of flesh, but a psychic evisceration, a violation that radiated from the core of his being out to the very tips of his fingers. Sharp, crystalline shards of pure torment lanced along his nerves, setting every synapse ablaze. His back arched violently against the cold metal slab, his body straining against the unyielding adamantine bands until he felt his joints might splinter. A scream built in his chest, a raw, tearing pressure that demanded release, but when it reached his throat, it found no voice. The golden light pouring into him stole his breath, stifled his cry, turning his ultimate anguish into a silent, convulsing parody of protest. He was a man being unmade in perfect, soundless horror. The golden light enveloped him completely, but its nature was now hideously clear. It was not a medium of transcendence, but a solvent. It did not welcome, it consumed. He could feel it digesting the edges of his consciousness, unraveling the memories of Lycus, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the feel of the red dust between his fingers. Each cherished moment was not honored but metabolized, converted into raw, screaming energy to feed the endless, silent hunger at the heart of the light. The initial hope that had carried him this far, the hope born of Alara's faith and his own desperate prayers, shattered. It did not break gently, but exploded into a million glittering shards of disillusionment, each one a sharp reminder of his own profound foolishness. He had not been a pilgrim approaching an altar, but a meal delivered to a table. The glorious service was a lie. The eternal light was a pyre, and he was just another piece of kindling. The final, fragile dam of Arians being shattered. The psychic hooks that had latched onto his soul now reeled in their catch with brutal mechanical efficiency. His consciousness did not simply drift away. It was torn, shredded into luminous, screaming streamers of self that were fed into the vast, silent hunger of the Golden Throne. The process was not a single event, but a series of waves, each one a fresh crescendo of excruciating pain that eclipsed the last. It was agony distilled to its purest form, a white-hot fire that burned away memory, thought, and identity, leaving only the raw, shrieking fact of suffering. His body on the slab became a distant, irrelevant thing, convulsing in a frantic, autonomic dance of nerves set alight, its struggles nothing more than the death throes of a puppet whose strings were being systematically severed. Through the torrent of his own dissolution, flashes of horrific understanding seared across his unraveling mind. The golden light was not a divine aura but a containment field. The warmth was the waste heat of a colossal, impossibly ancient machine, a psychic engine of terrifying complexity whose sole function was to transmute agony into power. He saw it then, not with his eyes but with his soul, the true nature of the Golden Throne. It was a gilded cage of arcane technology and writhing soul stuff, a device built not for transcendence, but for eternal, torturous sustenance. It was a heart that beat only by consuming other hearts, a mind that thought only by devouring other minds. And he was not alone in his torment. As his own essence was fed into the machine, his awareness briefly merged with the endless stream of fuel that sustained it. He became one with a chorus of the damned, a billion voices screaming in a silent, eternal unison. They were not at peace, not united in glorious purpose. They were trapped, their souls stretched on a rack of endless consumption, their pain the very electricity that powered the astronomican's baleful glare. He felt their collective agony, a symphony of despair played on an instrument of infinite suffering, each soul a single, eternally sustained note of pure horror. There was no gratitude here, no glory, only the ceaseless, grinding maw of a god machine that had forgotten how to do anything but hunger. His physical form was a prison, the cold slab his entire universe. Every nerve ending was a live wire, every muscle fiber a knot of seizing fire. His back arched and slammed against the unyielding metal, his fingers clawing at air, his jaw locked in a silent, endless scream. But he was trapped, held fast by the adamantine bands and the overwhelming psychic pressure of the ritual. There was no escape, no reprieve, not even the mercy of oblivion. He was being unmade with meticulous, mechanical slowness. His soul siphoned away in measured drafts to feed the silent, golden beast his body left. As a twitching, empty shell in the blinding, beautiful, and utterly horrifying light. In the final, coherent moments before his consciousness dissolved into the screaming torrent, a terrible and absolute understanding crashed down upon Arian. It was not a gradual dawning, but a single, shattering blow of truth that annihilated the last vestiges of the man he had been. The Emperor's light, the glorious beacon he had been taught to revere since childhood, was not a divine fire of protection, but a furnace. And its fuel was not faith or devotion, but raw, unending agony. The golden radiance that filled the chamber was the incandescent byproduct of a billion souls like his, each one screaming in silent, eternal torment, their suffering meticulously harvested and burned to power a machine that knew neither gratitude nor glory. The Astronomicon was not a lighthouse guiding humanity home. It was a pyre built from the endlessly replenished kindling of the Imperium's own children. A profound, an absolute sense of betrayal, colder and sharper than the metallic slab beneath him, lanced through the fading core of his being. He had served. He had believed. He had clung to the hope that his cursed existence could be redeemed through a final, noble sacrifice for the Imperium he had been taught to love and fear. He had marched willingly into the dark, clutching the fragile promise that his death would protect his family and contribute to a grand, celestial purpose. Now, he saw the monstrous truth. The Imperium was not a bastion of humanity. It was the very monster it claimed to fight, a vast, uncaring engine that consumed its own to sustain its own grim, mechanical existence. The priests, the guards, the entire labyrinthine bureaucracy, they were all servants of this consumption, herding their fellow humans into the dark with lies woven from sanctified words and empty ritual. His hope, that fragile, stubborn flame he had nurtured through the cold cell, the terrifying warp journey. And the grim descent did not merely die. It was extinguished utterly and forever in the face of this horrific reality. There was no meaning in his sacrifice, no legacy of honor, no footnote in a holy ledger. He was not a hero giving his life for a cause. He was a resource, a unit of psychic energy, a drop of pain added to an infinite, screaming ocean. The love for his family, the memory of Ilara's faith, the entire structure of belief that had defined his life, it all crumbled into dust, meaningless and small against the vast, hungry silence of the Golden Throne. His sacrifice was not a contribution to humanity's survival, but merely another moment in an endless cycle of suffering, his unique consciousness and all its loves and fears about to be obliterated and added to the collective, anonymous fuel. He was just another soul, screaming into the void, feeding a light that would never know his name. The agony did not end with a final, merciful snap, but with a slow, inexorable fading. Like the last ember of a fire cooling to gray ash, the waves of psychic torment that had been shredding his soul lost their sharp, defining edges, dissolving into a formless, numb static. The screaming chorus of the other damned souls, a billion-strong symphony of anguish that had filled the core of his being, grew distant, their individual voices blurring into a single, receding hum. The brilliant, consuming gold of the light dimmed, not to darkness, but to a vast and featureless gray. The pain, which had been the entirety of his existence, simply stopped. It was not a relief, for relief implies the cessation of something undesirable and the return to a prior state of comfort. This was an unraveling, this was nothingness. Arian's consciousness, what little remained of it, dissolved. It did not float or drift. It was absorbed, its unique signature, the memory of Lycus's red dust, the sound of his daughter's name, the shape of Alara's smile, eroded away by the vast, silent hunger. Emperor, the entity he was being fed to, was not a mind as he understood it, not a personality with thoughts and desires. It was a presence, an ocean of needs so immense and ancient that his own flicker of self was less than a single drop of water. There was no welcome, no acknowledgement, no divine judgment. There was only the hunger, a perpetual mechanical void that had been consuming for 10,000 years and would consume for 10,000 more. His essence was not joining a chorus. It was being metabolized by a silent, starving God. In that final, fleeting moment of coherent thought, a last, cold clarity settled over the dissolving remnants of Arian. He accepted it. There was no meaning in his death. There was no grand purpose, no noble service, no eternal reward waiting in the light. The stories of the Schola, the fervent beliefs of Alara, the desperate hope he had carried like a shield, they were all beautiful, intricate lies designed to make the cattle walk quietly to the slaughter. His life, his love, his fear, his final shattering revelation, none of it mattered. It was all just fuel. His existence was a brief, insignificant flare in the endless, grinding night, and its only purpose was to be extinguished to prolong the darkness for a little while longer. The last thing to go was the memory of them, not as a conscious, formed thought, but as a final, fading impression, a ghost of warmth in the infinite cold. A woman's laugh swallowed by silence. A child's hand, its grip dissolving into nothing. He reached for them with a will that was no longer his, across a distance that was no longer space. But they were gone, not just beyond his reach, but beyond the very concept of reaching. They were in a world of light and life, and he was becoming part of the eternal silent void that lay between the stars. The last spark of Arian of Lycus guttered and went out, and there was only the hunger. A flicker, a ghost of sensation, stirred in the vast, silent. Hunger. It was not a thought, for thought required a mind, and what remained of Arian was less than a shadow. It was a resonance, a faint psychic scar left on the fabric of the consuming entity, an echo of a self that had been thoroughly dismantled and digested. The golden light, which had been the totality of his final moments, now existed as a passive medium through which this echo perceived. A new presence was being led into the chamber, a fresh pulse of fear and life that vibrated through the static of endless torment. She was young, her face pale and smudged with grime, her eyes wide with a terror that was still sharp and personal, not yet worn smooth by the grim procession. Her dark hair was matted, and her thin hands trembled as they were clamped to the cold slab. The echo that had been Arian felt a distant, reflexive pang, a phantom limb of emotion. It was pity, a recognition of the specific, unique suffering that was about to be annihilated. He knew her journey, her stolen memories, the fragile hopes she doubtless clung to. He knew the precise moment when those hopes would shatter. For a single, impossible instant, the echo yearned to warn her, to scream across the void that her faith was a trap and her sacrifice a lie. But the impulse had no will to drive it, no voice to give it sound. It was a ripple that died instantly in the ocean of collective agony. The young woman's individuality, her specific terror, was a bright, brief flare, and as the ritual's energy began to build around her, the echo watched it begin to dissolve. Her fear blurred into the fear of the man who had come before her, and the woman before him, and the countless millions before them. Her silent scream joined the silent symphony. The pang of pity that had stirred the echo was itself absorbed, its unique quality sanded away, until it was indistinguishable from the general, ambient misery that was the true atmosphere of the Golden Throne. The echo's own fading identity, the last, tenuous claim to being Arian, crumbled completely. The memory of his family, already distant and bleached of emotion, dissolved into the psychic background radiation. The sound of Alara's voice merged with the droning of the priests, becoming just another component of the machine's monotonous rhythm. There was no longer an observer and the observed. The young woman's agony, the chanting of the priests, the cold of the slab, and the echo of a man from a frontier world, all of it bled together, their edges eroding into a single, seamless stream of suffering. He was no longer witnessing the next sacrifice. He was part of the medium through which she was consumed. The echo ceased to be an echo and became one with the endless, golden stream, another anonymous note in the chorus of the doomed, its final, fleeting moment of awareness subsumed into the perpetual, silent hunger. The machine, as it always had and always would, continued its work. The chanting of the crimson-robed priests was a constant, a rhythmic engine of sound that never faltered, their voices a seamless loop of litany and invocation that had echoed through the chamber for millennia. They moved with the same measured, soulless precision, their gestures unchanged, their empty eyes fixed on a purpose that had long since scoured away any vestige of individual will. They were cogs, perfectly machined and eternally turning, their humanity a forgotten prerequisite for a function that now required only motion and sound. Another gray-robed figure was guided forward, hands clamped to the cold, metallic slab, the adamantine bands hissing shut. The ritual was a dance whose steps never varied, performed for an audience of one, a silent, hungry god. The psykers came in an unbroken line, a river of sorrow flowing from the dark tunnels of Terra into the blinding, golden heart of the chamber. They were the fuel, each one a unique constellation of memories, fears, and hopes, each one a world of experience about to be extinguished. They arrived with prayers on their lips or terror in their hearts, clutching at faith or despair, but their end was always the same. The golden light welcomed them all, a solvent that did not discriminate, dissolving the saint and the sinner, the brave and the broken, into the same raw, screaming energy. Their individuality was a fleeting irrelevance, a spark that flashed for a moment against the infinite darkness before being consumed. They were fed into the throne, soul first, their essence unwound and metabolized to sustain the impossible fire that lit the void. The golden light burned on, a baleful, pulsating star at the center of the Imperium. It was not a gentle guide, but a raging inferno contained by arcane science and unimaginable will. Its warmth was the byproduct of an endless holocaust, its brilliance paid for with a currency of pure agony. It pushed back the howling madness of the warp, allowing humanity's ships to traverse the nightmare, ensuring that Imperium's grim dominion endured for another day, another hour. This was the great, unspoken bargain, the foundational sin upon which an empire of 1,000,000 worlds was built. Survival, purchased with an ocean of pain, delivered one screaming soul at a time. Somewhere in that ocean, a final, faint vestige of what had once been Aryan of Lycus dissolved completely. The last ghost of a memory, the feel of red dust, the sound of a name, evaporated, its final, unique resonance smoothed away into the featureless hum of the collective. His was not a presence that ended, but a pattern that was finally overwritten, his specific suffering blended perfectly into the whole. He was gone, not to an afterlife, but to a state of non-being, his existence converted, without gratitude or glory, into pure utilitarian power. The grim reality of the universe settled into its eternal, grinding rhythm. In the sprawling, brutal tapestry of the 41st millennium, there were no happy endings, only pauses in the suffering. There was no redemption in death, only repurposing. Hope was a lie told to make the inevitable palatable. Faith was a tool to ensure compliance. And sacrifice was not an act of heroism, but the basic, brutal mechanics of existence. Here, at the very heart of the human domain, even death was not an escape. It was not an end. It was a transaction. And in the silent, golden dark of the throne room, it served, as it always had, a silent, hungry master.